Hey everyone, welcome back to Inclusive Design 24 2020, brought to you in partnership with our Platinum supporters, Barclays Access and Adobe, our Gold supporters, Intopia, Tetralogical and InfoAxia, and our Silver supporters, Intuit and WebAble. You can follow us on Twitter at ID24Conf, and if you have any questions for our presenter, please tweet them using the ID24 hashtag for our Q&A at the end of the session. Also, a reminder for those of you tuning in that ID24 is a respectful community, and you can find our code of conduct on the inclusivedesign24.org event site. I am joined by my wonderful co-host, Melanie Sumner, who is here to introduce our next speaker. Take it away, Melanie.
Thank you, Eric. Next up, we have Sarah Broadwell talking to us about inclusive color, from photons to physiology to psychology and philosophy. Over to you, Sarah.
All right, thank you both. Hello, my name is Sarah Broadwell, and today I'm going to talk to you about the importance of color in inclusive design. And I'll also give you some tips about how to implement this knowledge in your work. And we'll also talk about more than just design choices. So not only just designers, but also if you're a UX researcher, a developer or a tester, or even if you work with built environments, or if you're just interested in how humans work in general. Hopefully you'll find something of value in this talk, because how we use colors has a massive impact on accessibility. We hear lots about contrast and tools and standards, but the choices that we make when it comes to color have so much more effect on the inclusiveness of our work than just sufficient contrast. In visual perception, a color is almost never seen as it really is, as it physically is. This fact makes color the most relative medium in art. In order to use color effectively, it is necessary to recognize that color deceives continually. That's a quote from The Interaction of Color by Joseph Albers, who is the artist whose work with color theory formed the foundation of modern art education. And that's the thing. Color seems like a simple subject at first, but when you start getting into it, you find out that it's about way more than just pigments and wavelengths and retinal cells. It's also about where you are, both physically and mentally, and who you are personally and culturally. So if we understand culture on a deeper level, or color on a deeper level, if we go from physics to physiology onto psychology and culture, that means we're much more likely to create products that go beyond just being accessible to being truly inclusive. So a little bit about me, so you can get an idea about why this topic interests me so much. I've been working with the web since 1995 or so, first as a hobby when I was studying cognitive science at the University of Oklahoma in the US. This hobby resulted in me spending an absolutely inordinate amount of time in the computer lab, and unsurprisingly, I ended up meeting another computer geek online. And as a result, in 1999, I moved to Norway. And I was really stoked because I got a job working as the webmaster for Opera Software. And that's where I started getting interested in web standards and accessibility. Eventually, I ended up getting a degree that was basically user experience before that was a thing. And I've kept on working with UX and front-end development since then. Now I work as an accessibility expert at the Norwegian Health Network, and I get to do the programming and the design and the psychology and the cognitive science stuff all at the same time. So it's definitely the most interesting and worthwhile job I've had in my career. And my experience is that approaching accessibility from a cross-disciplinary mindset, it makes a huge difference in the value I can provide to my organization. And color as a subject is just about as cross-disciplinary as one can find. So the plan is that we'll start out by talking about some of the basic concepts having to do with color, just to make sure you have a good basis for understanding the rest of the talk. And then we'll move on to talk about how physics creates color in combination with our physiology. We'll talk about how our experiences of color affect us both physically and psychologically, and we'll also talk about how we need to take culture into consideration when we make color choices. And finally, we'll look at some concrete ways you can use all of this in your work. Talking about color, it can be sometimes confusing because people use different terms to describe the same thing. And sometimes people use the same term to describe different things. So you hear words like saturation and chroma, lightness and brightness and luminance, tone and value. But as they say, words have meanings. So I'm going to go over some of the words I'm going to be using in the context of this talk, just so we can be sure that we're on the same page. So in the world of web, a lot of the terms that we use when we talk about color come from the HSL color space. That's H for hue, S for saturation, and L for lightness. And that's lightness, not luminance. And we'll get into that shortly. It's not really surprising that we use terms from this particular color space, as it was originally developed for television as a way to add color to monochrome broadcasts. And in the HSL model, the hues, what we think of as the colors, they're arranged radially around a vertical axis of grays that go from black at the bottom to white at the top. HSL is really just an alternative way of representing the RGB color model. That's red, green, and blue, and we'll talk about that in a bit more depth later. So the vertical axis in this color space, that's the one that goes from black at the bottom to white at the top. That's the axis that represents lightness. It is calculated as a percentage between 0 and 100, with 0 as black and 100% as white. Lightness is how we represent how bright we perceive a color to be. And that's to say, how do we perceive that color compared to white if we were looking at them both under the same light? Saturation is represented by the radius in this color space, moving from the colorless vertical axis out to the pure hues at the edge. And it's about the purity of the hue, how much color it seems to have in proportion to how bright it is. Saturation is calculated as a percentage between 0 and 100, with 100% being the pure hue, and then shading down to gray with no hue at all at 0. So pure hues, they have a saturation level of 100% and a lightness level of 50%. So halfway up the vertical axis and all the way out at the diameter in this diagram is where we will find the pure hues. So we represent hue by the degrees of angle in the color wheel. The top is at 0 or 360 degrees being red, and we have green at 120 degrees and blue at 240. A technical definition of hue is that it's the attribute of a visual sensation according to which an area appears to be similar to one of the perceived colors: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple. But a simpler definition of this is that hues are just what we often think about when we use the word color, most simply. So luminance then, we talk about this so much in accessibility with regard to contrast. What is luminance? We said that it's not the same as lightness. Lightness has to do with how bright we perceive a color to be. But luminance is objectively measurable. It has an SI unit, which is called candelas per square meter, and is also known as the nit. And the thing about luminance, it's really cool because it ties together human biology and perception back to physics. Luminance is actually a measure of radiant energy weighted by the spectral sensitivity of human retinal cells. So the colors that our eyes are physically most sensitive to are, per definition, the colors that have the highest luminance. High luminance can actually physically damage the retina by way of thermal, chemical, and even mechanical reactions. And that's why you're not supposed to look directly at lasers or the solar eclipse, and why you're told to wear sunglasses after having your eyes dilated. Luminance can actually hurt you. Relative luminance, though, it normalizes luminance to a value between 0 and 100, and it's these relative luminance values that the W3C uses to calculate contrast ratios. The relative luminance values in this grayscaled image here, they're the same as they were for the previous color image. Collapsing the image into grayscale shows how each hue itself contributes to luminance, even when we don't actually perceive the hue. So the luminance is the same, and that means that the contrast will be the same, even if we haven't got typical color vision. And that hopefully demonstrates the point of those contrast ratios that were used when we're shooting for inclusive design. If we make sure that the luminance alone provides sufficient contrast, then even people who don't have typical color vision will be able to use our designs. This image here is from a site called 8Shapes, which is a very, very useful way of showing contrast in different combinations in your color palette. So that's a little bit of color theory for the background, but it doesn't tell us much about how color actually works for humans. Color involves physics, as we touched upon, and the physics combines with our biology to produce an actual experience. So why might this have been a valuable trait for animals to evolve? What is the point of this experience? How does our experience of color actually affect our lives? And how does it affect society? It was musing, just as I was starting to structure this talk, an artist friend of mine posted an old XKCD comic about color theory. And it sort of paralleled what I wanted to talk about today. It talks about the author's understanding of color over time, from mixing primary colored paint in school and how wavelengths of light create rainbows, to a bit about the philosophical concept of qualia, and then to a bit more about biology and color models and color spaces, and then off into fantasy topology, and then finally dismissal, hopefully somebody else's problem. Well, it is our problem. So I'll go a little bit further than the comic goes. But we can start at the beginning, and that's when we were in kindergarten playing with paint. We were told that the primary colors are red, blue, and green, and that we could mix all the colors just using these 3 paints. When we tried to do this, however, we were very disappointed to find that the colors that we were trying to mix were muddy and yucky. But surely our teachers wouldn't lead us in the wrong direction. Why doesn't it work? So when we're talking about paint, it creates colors with pigments that absorb light. And the primaries, then, they are not red, yellow, and blue. They're cyan, magenta, and yellow. These colors, along with a bit of black, they will be familiar to anyone using, say, an inkjet color printer from way back when. And using those colors, we can make vivid hues like magenta and orange that we wouldn't be able to use if we were using red, yellow, and blue as primaries. So really, it's a mystery as to why our teachers let us down in this particular way. But this talk is mostly about color in the digital world, and that's an entirely different thing. So let's dive into how physics and our physiology interact to create the experience of color. And we'll also touch a little bit on history and philosophy. So back in the Dark Ages in Europe, people thought that vision happened because rays of light were being emitted from the viewer's eye. The rays would hit objects and then send an image back to the eye. But 10th century, during the Arab Golden Age, there was a scientist, philosopher called Ibn al-Haytham, who's called Al-Hasan in the Western world. And he's really the most celebrated scientist of that time. He had a theory of vision in which light traveled in straight lines and emanated from sources such as the sun or a candle. It didn't emanate from the viewer's eye. When the light hit an object, the reflected rays carried the image back into the viewer's eye. In addition, he investigated the origins of the rainbow using glass spheres filled with water. And he found that the light was refracted by the water, and the angle of refraction of the separate rays of the components of light, they were different. So this was a spectrum of different colored lights that matched the way the rainbow was produced. And this will sound pretty familiar because it was Newton who got the credit for this experiment. Much later, Newton had quarantined himself in order to avoid the plague. And he performed this experiment where he held a prism of glass in front of a beam of light that was coming through a hole in the blinds of his room. And then he witnessed the same thing. He saw that the white sunlight was split into a spectrum. And he saw that as being made up of 5 colors: red, yellow, green, blue, and violet. Interestingly, he would add orange and indigo later to expand the spectrum to 7 colors. And it seems like he did this because he felt like 7 was, it was in the zeitgeist. It was a more appropriate number for a natural phenomenon, because there's 7 notes in a Western musical scale, Western musical octave, and 7 days in the week. So he felt like there should also be 7 colors in the visible spectrum. But going back to the physics, here we have a diagram of the electromagnetic spectrum. The visible light part of the spectrum, it's the section of the electromagnetic radiation that equates to the colors that the human eye can actually see. And it ranges in wavelength from about 400 nanometers, which is violet, to around 700 nanometers, which is red. So we have 3 kinds of light-sensitive cells in our human eye, and we call those cone cells. The first of these responds to light of longer wavelengths, and it peaks at about 560 nanometers. And this is sometimes called the L cells for long, and this makes up the majority of the human cone cells. It peaks at yellow and orange. The second most common type responds to light of medium wavelength, and it peaks at about 530 nanometers. This is abbreviated M for medium, and it makes up about 1/3 of the cones in the human eye, responding mostly to wavelengths that are around green. And the third type responds the most to short wavelength light, at about peak at about 420 nanometers. We call these short cells. It's only about 2% of the cones in our eye, and this is in the range of blue. So as you can see in the graph, there is an overlapping response curve for each of these cells. And this is what makes it possible for us to see colors other than just blue and red and green. So if you look at the light in the range of orange, for example, it's maybe 577 to 600 nanometers. It enters the eye and hits the cells, and light at those wavelengths are going to activate both the medium and the long cells. And they're not going to do it equally. The long wavelength cells are going to respond more. So the difference in the response, this is detected by the brain. And that difference there is the basis of our perception of the color orange. So the orange experience, the way an orange object looks, it results from the light reflecting from that object, entering our eye and stimulating all these different cells simultaneously, but to different degrees. And this gives us an idea of how the RGB color model works. So the concept of a color model, it's basically a set of inputs and rules that describe how color impressions can be created. So how do these components and rules interact with each other? And RGB is different from the subtractive color model that we discussed earlier, the one having to do with pigments and paint. With RGB, it's an additive color model. So red, green, and blue light are added together to reproduce the colors that we can see. And you'll notice that the choice of these colors, it's very tightly coupled to the physiology of the human eye. Good primary colors are the colors that really have the maximum level of stimulus between the responses of those cells. That is what gives us a really good range of the colors that we can see. So to make a color in the RGB color model, you've got the three beams of light, red, green, and blue, and when you superimpose them, like for example, when they come out from a black screen in the way that Newton did, you get different combinations. You get these secondary colors that you see when the beams overlap. But what's a color space? We have the color model, which is really the inputs and the rules, but a color space is how many colors will be resulting from those combinations in the color model. With RGB, we have a triplet, and we can use that three-dimensional coordinate to specify a given color in the cube. And we tend to speak of this as a space because of this three-dimensional coordinate system. It's very easy to map onto basically a regular Cartesian system. But it's a nice theory. But we come up against the reality of the way human color vision works. And what you see here is the CIE 1931 color space. And it shows the wavelengths in pretty much a somewhat triangular shaped form, with red at one corner, blue and violet in another corner, and green at the other corner. And this kind of color space here was really it takes into consideration, again, the way the human body works, the way the human body reacts to light. And this color space is generally used as a sort of an absolute on which you can map other color spaces. So we have here, with the so-called normal human color vision, all of the colors that can be seen by the eye. And then when we use other forms of color space, such as RGB, it gives us an idea of what we can actually reproduce with that color space. So here we have two triangles that are superimposed on the CIE color space. One of them is sRGB, and this is something that was developed by Microsoft and HP, I think it was, to use on monitors and printers and the web. And this is also the color space that the W3C talks about most. It's supposed to match the typical home and office viewing environment, and like CRTs, how they used to use red, green, and blue. And this made it very easy to be accepted as the standard color model. But if we go back to this image of the spectrum and the response curves of the different cells, the three different kinds of cells that we have, we can look at the way color blindness interacts with this color space. So there's variations in the way that different humans' cells respond to different wavelengths. And if you look at the three different kinds of color blindness, tritanopia is when we have problems with the cells that are most responsive to blue. Deuteranopia is when we have issues with the cells that are most responsive to yellow and green. And protanopia is when we have issues with the cells that are most responsive to red. So if we look again at this map of typical color vision, this is the result of how someone with typical color vision would see the rainbow. And when we have protanopia, if we look at the corner with 700 nanometers, we can see exactly which colors, this is called confusion lines. We can see which colors are most likely to be an issue for people with this kind of color blindness. And this is the way the image would tend to look for people with protanopia. Deuteranopia, this is issues with the green cells again. And if we look at the lines as they're displayed across the CIE color space, we can see which colors would tend to be confused by people with that form of color blindness. And here's an example of what that would look like. Tritanopia, again, that's issues with the blue cells. And we can see these confusion lines here. These show the colors that will tend to be confused by people with that kind of color blindness, which is the most rare. Monochromacy is quite rare, but we can see this as how people who, how we would see the world in dark light, for example. So we talked about these 3 types of cells that overlap. Interestingly, there's actually variations in the peak frequencies between people. So something like 68% of people have a different peak frequency for some of their cells, and that means they are seeing a different color of green than the other people. There's also the concept of tetrachromacy. It's pretty rare, more common in women than in men. But this extra cone, it's not really very useful for women because it's not very different from the cones that already exist. We saw some press about this a little while back. Only 1 in 4 people can see all the colors in this box. Can you? And it purported to test for if you have this 4th kind of cone, but most people's monitors actually cannot display colors in a way that would tease out whether or not you have this genetic variation. But why would this be beneficial at all? So animals' physiology, it responds most to wavelengths of the environment in which they evolved. So fish, for example, their eyes are more responsive to blue, and apes, for example, are more responsive to green. Most mammals have dichromatic vision, but around 30 million years ago, primates evolved trichromatic vision. So some people think this was to see ripe fruit over long distances. But another theory is that this was a way in which animals could perceive sexual swelling, for example. And this new 3rd kind of cone was adapted to the wavelengths that show changes in blood oxygen levels, which shows emotion. So primates that have trichromatic vision, they have bare areas without hair, usually on their rear or on their face. And primates with dichromatic vision that can only see 2 colors, they have fur over their entire bodies. So this might also be a clue as to why we blush. This is an indication of how people feel shame, or they understand they've broken some sort of social compact. Psychologically, we talked a little bit about Joseph Albers. He started discussion of color with black and whites to demonstrate the extent to which our perceptions of color are affected by the surrounding colors. And we can see this demonstrated with the effect of relative contrast. So due to the different background colors, we perceive the smaller gray boxes to be of different lightness. But when we look at all the boxes together, we can see that they are of the same color. So context matters here. We know that when people can't see the color of wine that they're drinking, they have different perceptions of whether it's actually red or white. They can't distinguish it unless they see the color. Psychologically, we also know that blue light can have an effect on human psychology. So in Japan, for example, they installed blue lights in the subway stations in Tokyo, and that actually reduced the number of suicides by maybe up to 74%, probably not quite that much. But it's a very powerful effect. Physiologically, we also know that red increases the skin galvanic response, and it increases the heart rate and respiration rate. So when we use that in designs, it's great if we want to use it for call to action buttons and things that make people really excited, but not so great if it's something that we want people to feel calm about. This is a picture of assistive tableware called Eatwell. And This was developed by a designer who had a grandmother with Alzheimer's disease. The designer found that when you use the color blue, for example, since it doesn't appear in food, it helps people distinguish the food from the dish. And the red, for example, stimulates appetite. So when using this tableware, people actually consumed 20% more food and 80% more liquid. It really makes a difference. These choices we use to people's lives, it's not just pop psychology. In terms of the built world, this is deaf space at Gallaudet University. So members of the deaf community, they probably experience more eye strain than others since their language is visual. And these green and blue tones, they provide a really good contrast with people's skin. So that means it's actually easier for people to pick up what people using sign language are saying. We also know that these soft colors help calm people who have ADHD or autism. Colors also help people with dyslexia, or can cause problems for people with dyslexia or sensory processing disorders. It can also work in wayfinding, as in this case, where my dad has programmed his laptop keyboard to use different colors to highlight different areas of the keyboard based on their functionality. So it's a very powerful tool we can use that really physically and psychologically has an effect on people. Culture-wise, we know that different cultures attribute different meanings to different colors. And we also know that the meaning of colors can change. The Black Lives Matter movement, for example, has really changed the way that we use the term Black in society today. So I think it's GitLab, for example, has decided to stop using the terms blacklist and whitelist. Now, this wasn't even a consideration a year ago before the Black Lives Matter movement came to be a thing. The color green, for example, is culturally relative in that in Islam, it's considered to be, it's associated with Islam, whereas in other cultures, it's associated with, for example, the Green Party. So depending on where you are going to be promoting your website, it makes sense to consider the colors that you're going to be using in your profile. Okay, so this is all well and good. How do we apply this knowledge in real life? How is it going to help us with our work? The goal at the most basic level is people need to be able to use the products regardless of how they perceive or do not perceive color. So the stuff I just talked about, how does it help us reach that goal? And by us, I do mean pretty much everybody listening to this talk. Everyone plays a role. So a little rant here. A lot of the responsibilities that we have, they're far from specific to color inclusion in general. But in my work, I see that when we lack support, it's very hard to reach the goal of inclusive design. So I think this support, it actually starts with activists. They have to create awareness, and that helps us carve out space to implement change. And another piece of the puzzle is making sure that we get inclusive design knowledge into the educational system. It doesn't really matter how much space we have to work with inclusive design if we don't know how to actually make that happen. We also need to stress the value proposition of inclusive design. The ethical and legal arguments are not enough. When the people paying for products understand the business proposition, they're going to be much more likely to get people on the team who know their stuff. We also have to consider who is it we want to include? Who's the target audience? What are their needs? What's the context? And researching this problem space affects what finally gets built. We need to have all of these structures in place, or we will not be able to use the knowledge that we have. So rant over, onto the nitty-gritty. So designers, the role of the designer is to translate user needs into instructions for what gets built. The designer basically produces a hypothesis for how the product can solve user needs. They provide instructions for what needs to be implemented. By far the greatest source of accessibility issues in the final product is a lack of purposeful design. So regardless of whether or not you provide a design, something is going to be implemented. Sometimes the developers have to guess, and sometimes it's going to be the default. Sometimes that's enough, but it's seldom going to be consistent. And when the problems are discovered, we face a lot of rework, which is expensive. So most important is the designers have a responsibility to provide a design for all states. So it's not just text links and buttons. It's all the variations of these, not just visited links, but also hover and active. Disabled buttons, they need to be perceptible as well if people need to understand that functionality in order to understand the content in general. You'd also think that text, it's enough to just follow the regular contrast requirements. But you need to take into consideration that some people highlight text in order to make it easier to read, to keep the place in the document, or even just as a nervous habit. So the designers need to provide a design for this as well that follows the contrast rules. The most basic thing is to provide ways of communication other than just color differences. If you look at the London Tube map, for example, it uses color to differentiate the lines. But those colors have also been chosen in such a way that they provide enough luminance contrast to communicate the information even in monochrome. And we don't need to rely only on luminance contrast. We also have the option of using patterns, for example, or icons or contrast in the size of area. So contrast and luminance is far from the only way to communicate differences. We need to consider also all of our users. It's not just people who are colorblind. It's people who have sensory processing disorders, people who can get migraines. And these things are not listed in the standard, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't take it into consideration. We really need to go beyond the standard. And of course, the basic thing, we have to consider contrast. And rather than designing a separate high contrast mode, we need to make our contrast good enough in the default design. Also, anchor this early with your stakeholders. When things have already been marketed, it's going to be very difficult to change it afterwards. It will involve a lot of rework, which means a lot of money. Quickly, developers have a responsibility to realize this decision. They deliver the actual product, and they need to know how to make their work not only true to the design, but also robust and reliable and flexible. So we've got a lot of media queries that are coming now that will be very useful for night mode, for example, device color limitations and contrast preferences. And it helps developers to know about this so that they can encourage designers to provide these modes. There's also issues with regard to opacity and stacking order, details you have to understand here, which I'm running out of time, so I need to hurry up here. But it's good to know that this is something that you should consider when you are using different opacities. Animating colors is often going to be easier when you're working in HSL, just because it's going to be easier to edit those numbers dynamically. And I also recommend developers get the colors directly from the designers or a design system, because designers do not always use the same color codes in all of their systems. So testing, this is when design and development meet the real world, and testers ensure that everything works as it should so that people actually get to experience the good designs that we provide. Contrast, of course, I'm not going to go through the tools here. You can find that information online, but it's not enough just to look at automated tools or just look in the browser. You should do spot checking, because it's not necessarily what the devs coded that gets rendered into the browser. Test also in different contexts, like with a blue light filter. These are more common now. Test with night mode, pretty much every variation that people use. And this includes different layouts, especially over background images. Just as designers are designing all states, testers need to check for them. And you can use simulators, of course, but there is no replacement for testing on actual devices in real context. And there's no replacement for user testing, which is going to give an idea about language use or cultural issues, for example. So as you can see, we all have a role to play. So customers and management, it's important that you lay the foundation so that the researchers, the designers and the devs and the testers, they can take this subject into consideration in their work, more than just simple contrast requirements. So my hope is that you come away from this talk with a deeper understanding of how color works, and that the understanding will help you produce more inclusive products, regardless of what role you have in your team. The physical world and the body, they interact to create color, and this interaction affects our experiences of the world in real physiological and psychological ways. And there are many things that we can do to ensure that the products we create take all of this into consideration to avoid excluding people. And our goal then is to take all of this knowledge in the background to make that experience a positive one. So thank you for listening, and please do feel free to get in touch. You can reach me at Twitter at sjbroadwall or email at sarah@broadwall.no. Yeah, any questions?
Yeah, Sarah, thank you so much for that talk. It was absolutely illuminating, and I really appreciated you doing it. Melanie, do we have any questions coming in?
You know, I think I'm going to have to try drinking some wine without looking at it to see if I can taste the difference. Like, oh, that sounds fun.
You also have to make sure the temperature is the same.
Yes, absolutely. I do have a question for you. What do you think, Sarah, about the future of color on the web? I feel like we see trends every few years, brands going through rebranding exercises. Maybe the CEO doesn't like the color or something. Do you think as we get to know more about color and about how humans perceive color, we'll see some changes to how we approach color and branding?
I'd like to think so. I think it's especially now that we are more aware of different parts of the world, that's going to help take into consideration what colors we should and shouldn't use in our branding. And also, it's only recently that we had much awareness about autism or dyslexia and how different levels of contrast and different colors affect the way those people are included by our color choices. So my hope is that we'll learn more about this and can apply that knowledge. This is, as you can see, I had such a hard time stuffing all the information I wanted to stuff into this talk.
Mm-hmm.
So much to know. So I'd like to see this addressed more in education so that we can take those things into consideration.
So I think what you mentioned about cultures was really interesting. How do you approach investigating like the cultural context of color?
Recently, I've really only been doing any sort of designing or accessibility work in Norway. But one example is that we're just doing a redesign now, and we wanted to have, originally the designers wanted to have a pretty bright, really blood-like red for the call to action buttons. And I showed the example of an airline website that uses red for a call to action. And that's great if you want to increase people's heart rate and get them excited. But when you're doing a health website, that's not what you want. You want people to be
that
calm.
would be scary. Yeah.
You don't want people afraid to click the button.
Yes, for me, red means stop. Don't do it, right?
So that was a fun discussion to have. And that's, again, the thing with the stakeholders, getting that anchoring with the stakeholders. That's hard to change afterwards.
Absolutely. Those are the questions I have. Eric, back to you.
Yeah, so you had mentioned kind of a little bit in passing, not night mode, or sorry, not dark mode, but night mode, which is kind of like the color filter display some operating systems have. Kind of what are your thoughts about it and kind of its presence and its effectiveness?
I think it's absolutely fabulous. I myself have a sleep disorder, and this is actually something that we use to treat that kind of disorder. Doctors sometimes have you go around with orange glasses so you're avoiding blue light later in the day, and that will actually help you reset your schedule. I think it's fabulous that this is starting to be a more common thing and people are getting more awareness of it. We spend so much time staring at screens. Anything that we can do to prevent that from making us sick really is wonderful. But we really have to test. You see the difference if you use a very strong orange filter. There are a lot of things that start to look pretty strange.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. Another kind of question for you, I think we have time for one more. Kind of just your thoughts on how we historically have kind of taught people about color, especially children, and then kind of where you think that's going.
I don't have kids myself, so I can't say much about where it's going. But I found it odd because it's really not addressed very much. We learn this red, green, blue primary, but it pretty much stops there. And I think people tend to feel kind of frustrated when they're trying to mix these bright colors that match what they see in the world and they have no idea why it doesn't work. I think this is really low-hanging fruit to bring more ideas from color theory, more color concepts into pretty basic education. It will really turn people more onto art and design in general, and that will be great.
Yeah, totally. And then selfishly, do you remember the name of that tool that you were using to generate the matrix of color values?
It's called H-Shapes. And I can post a link to it on Twitter. You can enter many different colors and you can name the colors, and it shows you a matrix of all the different combinations and whether or not the contrast is sufficient to pass the standards. Yeah. It's a very useful tool. There's so many tools, but that one I feel is undervalued.
Yeah, I do agree. I think the tooling around color has gotten really good as of late, and I'm really excited to see where it goes.
Well, there's a lot that's good, but also there's a lot that's misleading. So it's worth trying a bunch of different things and finding what works for you. But you can't always trust automated systems. There's a lot of false positives you get.
Yeah, and I guess that one last question, I said it was the last, but I lied. What would you kind of use as a gut check for evaluating the quality of these tools?
When I'm using that tool, so I teach a lot of people in my work, and I teach them to use different tools. And I notice I get a lot of questions from people about some tools and not so many from other tools. So it's really this thing about the false positives for testing with contrast. When I see that, then I need to look for something else. It's showing me that it's really not focusing on the right things. We need to use our brains when we're doing this. We can't just accept whatever it is an automated tool says.
Yeah, fantastic. I completely agree. Sarah, thank you again so much. This was an amazing talk. Thank you for taking the time to share it with us today. For the viewers attending, thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this session, if I could trouble you to hit that YouTube like button, that does a lot for helping us out, for getting the word out. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/inclusivedesign24. That'll help you stay in the loop for future events and announcements. And as well, a reminder that Inclusive Design 24 is brought to you with thanks and support from Barclays Access, Adobe, Intopia, Tetralogical, InfoAxia, Intuit, WebAble, DeQ Systems, and Adrian Roselli LLC. We'll be back at the start of the new hour with a brand new talk. Thank you very much.